With his top American field commanders, Generals Bradley, Patton, and Hodges, General Eisenhower plotted carefully the exact course of the Allied armies in the final phase of the battle for Europe.
It was desirable to thrust our spearheads rapidly across Germany to a junction with the Red forces, thus to divide the country and effectually prevent any possibility of German forces acting as a unit.
In Berlin, Nazi party leaders like Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels were reminded more and more forcibly that the Allies were drawing closer. Allied planes now paid daily visits to the German capital. Resistance to the Allies was becoming much more difficult for the Nazis in all phases of their war effort. With fuel supplies at a new low, German trucks in Berlin were often taken in tow by trolley cars. On every level, the operation of the life of the city was crippled more seriously as the fronts on both the east and the west were pushed closer to Berlin. The Nazis were trapped in their doomed capital, but still refused to submit to the inevitable. The Allies sent out urgent appeals for the German people to surrender via broadcasts in their own language from Allied control stations, such as Radio Luxembourg. These broadcasts reached many thousands of German citizens. The German people were also advised that they would not be tortured and executed, an idea that had been drummed into them by the Nazi propaganda machines.
Dies bringt die Gesamtzahl der deutschen Soldaten, die sich in alliierten Kriegsgefangenenlagern in Sicherheit befinden, auf 9. I surrender.
These broadcasts were effective. As the American soldiers took over control of Nazi towns and cities, many Germans, no longer dominated by the Wehrmacht, were quick to put themselves in Allied hands. Many were still fearful that the Nazi claims about their torture by Allied soldiers might be true, but were soon convinced to the contrary.
It now appeared that a double envelopment would not only finally and completely sever the industrial Ruhr from the remainder of Germany, but would result in the destruction of one of the major forces still remaining to the enemy. The industrial importance of the Ruhr to Germany had been greatly diminished, even before we surrounded it. As a consequence of the threats now developing on both sides of that area, it would have seemed logical for the Germans to withdraw their military forces for use in opposing our forward advances. Certainly, it should have been clear that with the Ruhr surrounded, there would be lost whatever military forces might be jammed into its defenses. Bradley's forces on the south and Montgomery's in the north fought steadily toward their appointed meeting place near Kassel. The resistance to Simpson's 9th Army, which was on the right of Montgomery's army group, was more stubborn than that encountered by the 1st and 3rd Armies advancing out of the Frankfurt area. As a result, the southern arm of our pincers swung well around the eastern and northeastern flanks of the Ruhr to meet Simpson's advancing columns in the vicinity of Lippstadt, near Paderborn. By April 1st, just 1 week after the 21st Army Group had crossed the Rhine in the Basel sector, the junction was complete. The Ruhr was surrounded, and its garrison was trapped. The Germans had now suffered an unbroken series of major defeats. On April 18th, the whole German garrison in the Ruhr surrendered. Originally, we had estimated we would capture about 150,000 of the German army in the Ruhr. In the final count, the total reached 325,000, including 30 general officers. We destroyed 21 divisions. Hitler must have hoped that the siege of the Ruhr would be as stubbornly contested as was that of Brest. But within 18 days of the moment the Ruhr was surrounded, it had surrendered with an even greater number of prisoners than we had bagged in the final Tunisian collapse almost 2 years earlier.
During the final phase of the battle for Europe, the Nazi soldiers looked less and less formidable. The Wehrmacht, once composed of the pick of German young manhood, now included in its ranks youths who were really still children. Policing the Nazi prisoners had become a more demanding job. Sometimes former inmates of Nazi concentration camps were put in charge of guarding captured Nazi soldiers. The vital industries of the Ruhr, now completely lost to the Nazis, further crippled the badly weakened German war effort. The foundation on which Hitler's plans for world conquest had been built lay hopelessly smashed. With the Allies pushing steadily eastward, General Eisenhower paid a visit to General Patton at Gotha on April 12th, a notable date for the Supreme Commander.
Before the day ended, the scenes I saw etched the date in my memory. General Patton's army had overrun and discovered Nazi treasure, hidden away in a deep salt mine. In one tunnel, they found a hoard of gold estimated to be worth about $250 million, most of it in gold bars. There was also a great amount of minted gold from different countries in Europe, and even from the U.S. The same day, I saw my first horror camp. It was near the town of Gotha. I have never felt able to describe my emotional reactions when I first came face to face with indisputable evidence of Nazi brutality and ruthless disregard of every shred of decency. Up to that time, I had known about it only generally or through secondary sources. I am certain, however, that I have never at any other time experienced an equal sense of shock. I visited every nook and cranny of the camp because I felt it my duty to be in position from then on to testify at first hand about these things in case there ever grew up at home the belief or assumption that the stories of Nazi brutality were just propaganda. I felt that the evidence should be immediately placed before the American and British publics in a fashion that would leave no room for cynical doubt.
With enemy forces in the Ruhr eliminated, the Allied attack to the eastward picked up momentum on all parts of the front. The route, which every Allied soldier kept constantly in mind, lay toward the Baltic Sea and Berlin. The principal attack was a major thrust at the center of the German line by the 12th Army Group under General Bradley's command.
Bradley's advance was conducted on a broad front. On the south, the Third Army struck in the direction of the Czechoslovakian border. On Patton's left, the First Army attack, begun on April 11th, made rapid progress. On April 14th, the 3rd Armored Division of Collins's 7th Corps reached Dessau, practically on the Elbe. This corps, which had been in the original assault against the Normandy beaches and soon thereafter had captured Cherbourg, had fought all the way across northwest Europe, from the coast of France to the river Elbe. The stage was now set for the final Allied moves of the campaign. The enemy had no means of restoring a single front against either the Russians or ourselves.
Throughout western Germany, as the Allied front moved swiftly eastward, some units were charged with checking on areas which the frontline troops had passed through hurriedly. The GIs rounded up a number of spies, and in addition, German soldiers who had quickly changed into civilian clothes. Whenever any Nazis in either classification were caught, the penalty was quickly executed by Allied military units.
And fire!
As more and more territory was captured by the Allies, thousands of American soldiers held captive by the Germans were recovered. Many of them had been taken prisoner as early as December 1942 in the early battles in Tunisia. And some of the British soldiers had been captured as far back as Dunkirk, nearly 5 years before.
In many instances, the physical condition of the prisoners was so poor that great care had to be exercised in their feeding. The weaker ones were hospitalized, and for a period, our hospitals were crowded with men whose joy at returning to their own people was almost pathetic. but who at the same time were suffering so badly from malnutrition that only expert care could save them.
My name is Charles J. Short. I'm from Akron, Ohio. I was captured in the Battle of the Bulge, December 19th, 1944. After making us walk for about 40 miles, I believe our worst experience was being packed on a small boxcar, 60 men to one car. During this time, we had received absolutely nothing to eat. After we had gotten on the boxcar, we received about this amount of bread, a one-day's ration. Occasionally, we got a bucket of water to drink.
With the Allies and the Russians drawing within range of each other, both forces had to use extreme caution to keep from finding themselves suddenly firing into or overrunning the other's lines. Russian liaison officers served with the Western Allied force and kept Soviet commanders informed of the advance of the British and American frontline troops.
On April 25th, patrols of the 69th Division of the 5th Corps met elements of the Red Army's 58th Guards Division on the Elbe. The meeting took place at Torgau, 75 miles south of Berlin. The 5th Corps, like the 7th, had participated in the initial assault on the beaches of Normandy, and it seemed fitting that the troops of one of these corps should be the first to make contact with the Red Army and accomplish the final severance of the German nation.
In late April 1945, the savage battle for Berlin, so long feared by the German people, was begun. The Russians under Marshal Zhukov had penetrated deep into the Nazi capital. The battle raged on for some 12 days of intensely heavy fighting. The Russians had to rout the Nazis out of every cranny in the city, and in some cases, from hideouts below the ground. The last of the defenders surrendered to the Russians on May 3rd. Soviet commanders estimated that the futile defense of Berlin had cost the Germans 500,000 killed and captured. The climax of a war which had cost both sides hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded was finally over. After 4 exhausting years in which they had beaten the Nazis off in their drive toward Moscow, the Russians had won Berlin. The Nazi swastika, symbol of Hitler's new order, no longer flew over the city. Berlin was no longer a seat of German government, no longer capital of a German nation. For the first time in a century, a foreign power was in possession of the capital of the once mighty German nation. The Russians who first occupied Berlin were elated at the damage resulting from the saturation bombings by the British and American air forces in the months preceding the fall of the city. The Nazi Empire, which Hitler had predicted would last for 1,000 years, had been crushed to death only 12 years after its beginning. The devoted Nazi Party followers had run the gamut from fanatical mass hysteria following their early victories to humiliating total defeat. The conquerors of Berlin took especial delight in unfurling their flag from Nazi symbols of military glory, like the Brandenburg Gate. And the sacred precincts of the Reichschancellery were now invaded by the calm but exultant Russian leaders. Reminders of the once worshipped Führer no longer had a place of eminence. In late April, the first official surrender by a Nazi area command took place at Caserta, Italy. The envoys of the top Nazi generals in the Italian theater surrendered unconditionally to the Allies on April 29th. The German surrender of Nazi-held territory in Italy and Austria was to become effective at noon on the 2nd of May. In the north, at Lüneburg Heath, on May 4th, the Germans surrendered to the Allies, represented by Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery, all their forces in northwestern Europe, except for the Nazi garrison in Norway.
The German command to carry out at once And without argument or comment, all further orders that will be issued by the Allied powers on any subject. Disobedience of orders or failure to comply with them will be regarded as a breach of these surrender terms and will be dealt with by the Allied powers in accordance with the accepted laws and usages of war. The decision of the Allied powers will be final if any doubt or dispute arises as to the meaning or interpretation of the surrender terms. That is the text of the instrument of surrender, and the German delegation will now sign this paper. And they will sign in order of seniority, and General Admiral von Friedeberg will sign first. Now, General Kinsall will sign next. Now, I will sign the instrument on behalf of the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower. Now, that concludes the formal surrender, and there are various matters now of detail to be discussed, which we will do in closed session.
Complete Nazi capitulation came on May 7th at Reims, when the Allies, represented by General Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, accepted the surrender of Colonel General Alfred Jodl on behalf of the Nazi High Command.
All hostilities were to cease at midnight on May 8th. The surrender instrument was signed by Jodl at 2:41 in the morning of May 7th, 1945. The campaigns in the Mediterranean and in Europe had no prior parallel in the history of warfare. Throughout them, the United States Army had engaged in operations without comparable precedent since its establishment in 1775. Foremost among the military lessons was the extraordinary and growing influence of the airplane in the waging of war. The European campaign almost daily developed new and valuable uses for air power. Its effect in the weakening of German capacity was decisively felt on both the eastern and western fronts. Beyond this, the airplane was a valuable logistics agent, particularly during our speedy dashes across France and later across Germany. Without it, those pursuits could never have proceeded with such speed, nor could they have accomplished such remarkable results. The combination of an overwhelming air force and the great mobility of ground forces enabled us to strike any chosen point along a front of hundreds of miles. Our experiences had reaffirmed the truth that unity, coordination, and cooperation are the keys to successful operations. War is waged in three elements, but there is no separate land, air, or naval war. Unless all assets in all elements are efficiently combined and coordinated against a properly selected common objective, their maximum potential power cannot be realized. Physical targets may be separated by the breadth of a continent or an ocean, but their destruction must contribute in maximum degree to the furtherance of the combined plan of operation. That is what coordination means. we re-examined the role of the fundamental agent in military success, the individual soldier. The trained American possesses qualities that are almost unique. Because of his initiative and resourcefulness, his adaptability to change, and his readiness to resort to expedient, he becomes, when he has attained a proficiency in all the normal techniques of battle, a most formidable soldier. Veteran organizations are normally more capable than those entering battle for the first time. However, experience in fighting does not engender any love of the battlefield. Veterans have no greater desire to enter the bullet-swept areas than have green troops. They do become more skillful in the utilization of every advantage offered by firepower, maneuver, and terrain. They acquire a steadiness that is not shaken by the confusion and destruction of battle. Early in the war, it became evident that the emotional stamina and spiritual strength of the individual soldier were as important in battle success as his weapons and training. In any kind of warfare, troop morale is a decisive factor. The campaigns in the Mediterranean and in Europe had no prior parallel in the history of warfare. Throughout them, the United States Army had engaged in operations without comparable precedent since its establishment in 1775. For the operations in Africa and Europe, there had been involved the organization of a vast ground force, built around 47 infantry divisions and their artillery. Some divisions bore far more than their share of combat. The 34th, 45th, 3rd, and 1st Divisions led in the number of days in battle, with total days in combat between 438 and more than 500. No pre-war definition of the Army's mission could adequately have forecast the scope or ramifications of its job against the European Axis. Victory in the Mediterranean and European campaigns gave the lie to all who preached or shall preach that the democracies are decadent, afraid to fight, unable to match the productivity of regimented economies, unwilling to sacrifice in a common cause. In dozens of ways, scientists and inventors transformed the face of war. Early in July, I learned that there would be a test in New Mexico of the atomic bomb, which American scientists had finally succeeded in developing. At the time, I expressed the hope that we would never have to use such a thing against any enemy, because I disliked seeing the United States take the lead in introducing into the war something as horrible and destructive as this new weapon was described to be. I did not then know, of course, that an army of scientists had been engaged in the production of the weapon and that secrecy in this vital matter could not have been maintained indefinitely.
But in July 1945 at Alamogordo, New Mexico, the most critical experiment in centuries was shrouded in secrecy.
The automatic controls got it now. Rob, this time the stakes are really high.
It's going to work all right, Robert, and I'm sure we'll never be sorry for it.
Well, in 40 seconds, we'll know.
Only such leading atomic scientists as Dr. Vannevar Bush, Harvard President James Bryant Conant, and a few top government officials knew what was about to happen.
Minus 10 seconds. Minus 5 seconds. Now!
All the developments in method, equipment, and destructive power that we were studying seemed minor innovations compared to the revolutionary impact of the atom bomb.
The Russian people experienced a great surge of relief after 4 years of the most bitter and exhausting warfare. The great victory over Germany marked the start of a new era for the Soviets, an era of new importance for the Russian nation. When Soviet Russia accepted Nazi Germany's surrender at Berlin, she achieved a new peak position as a major world power. In that role, she would have a strong voice in the control of the world's affairs and play a decisive part in the attempt to forge a lasting peace.
The Western allies were invited and expected to participate in the signing at Berlin, but I felt it would be inappropriate for me personally to go. I thought the ratification in Berlin should be a Soviet affair. Consequently, I designated my deputy, Air Chief Marshal Tedder, to represent me at the ceremony.
The formal signing at Berlin was conducted 2 days after the surrender to the Allies at Reims, which officially ended the European phase of the war. The Russians, though represented at Reims, wanted an additional ritual.
Under the terms of the surrender document, the heads of the German armed services were required to appear in Berlin on May 9th to sign a ratification in the Russian headquarters. The second ceremony was, as we understood it, to give notice to the Germans and to the world that the surrender was made to all, not merely to the Western allies.
With the Russian commanders watching with deep satisfaction, Field Marshal General Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief of the High Command, signed the surrender document, followed by Air Chief Marshal Tedder for the Western Allies and Marshal Zhukov for the Soviets. Less than a month later, representatives of the 4 victorious powers met in Berlin for the first formal session of the Allied Council for Control of Germany.
What permanence the new won peace might have, even what the future course of civilization would be. The answers to these questions now clearly involved, as an important factor, the ability of the East and West to work together and live together in one world.
The victory over the Nazis occasioned a continuing celebration. German soldiers were paraded ignominiously through the streets of Moscow under Red Army Guard for the edification of the Russian people. The Russians took special delight in the humiliation of the defeated Nazi officers.
The experience of Russia in World War II was a harsh one. So many men, women, and children had been killed that the Russian government would never be able to estimate the total. The year 1941 saw the whole western portion of the country overrun by the Nazis. From the region of the Volga westward, almost everything was destroyed. All this would have embittered any people. It would have been completely astonishing if the Russians had not had a more direct and personal vindictiveness toward the Germans and a sterner attitude toward the realities of war than was the case in countries far removed from the scene of hostilities.
The Red Army, so badly underrated by the Nazi High Command at the time of Germany's treacherous attack on Russia, proved itself a magnificent fighting mechanism throughout 4 years of battle of staggering proportions. During the Russo-German War, the Red Army killed and captured an estimated 10 million Nazis in a series of overwhelming victories, but victories won at great expense.
The most costly form of warfare, and the one in which the diminishing power of the offensive soonest manifests itself, is the tactical advance by superior forces that gradually gains ground against a flexible and skillful defense. Marshal Zhukov and I frequently discussed the campaigns of the war. As far as I could see, he had given little concern to the methods that we considered vitally important to the maintenance of morale among American troops, systematic rotation of units, and, above all, development of techniques to avoid exposure of men to unnecessary battlefield risks, all of which, although common practice in our Army, seem to be largely unknown in his. Even in their successful offensives, they paid a terrible price for victory. Great victories, the Russians seem to think, inevitably required huge casualties. Because of Marshal Zhukov's special position for several years in the Red Army, he had had a longer experience as a responsible leader in great battles than any other man of our time. It seems that he was habitually sent to whatever Russian sector appeared at the moment to be the decisive one.
Many a German retreat was the result of Zhukov's strategy.
He agreed with me that destruction of enemy morale must always be the aim.
The basic differences between Russian and American attitudes in the conduct of the war was reflected in every aspect of combat against the Nazis. The Russians killed as many of the enemy as possible. And when they did take prisoners, the captured Nazis considered themselves much less fortunate than their brothers in arms who surrendered to the Western Allies.
It was not until the final months of the war that the Soviets began, in a military sense, to gain the great rewards paid for by their earlier severe sacrifices. Proud of their victories, the Russians always remembered with bitterness their cost. The extraordinary suffering of the population and the length of time that Russia endured the rigors and privations of battle combined to make the war on the Eastern Front one of the memorable sieges of history. On all sides, there was evidence of the destruction that Hitler's ruthless ambition had brought about. Every battle, every skirmish demanded its price in broken bodies and in the extinction of the lives of young Allied soldiers. I had a more sympathetic understanding of the Russian attitude than would have been possible before the beginning of the war.
At Yalta, in the Russian Crimea, in February 1945, the heads of government of the United States, Great Britain, and Soviet Russia convened to discuss matters relating to joint administration, principally the post-war control of Germany.
In the past relations of America and Russia, there was no cause to regard the future with pessimism. Historically, the two peoples had maintained an unbroken friendship that dated back to the birth of the United States as an independent republic. Except for a short period, their diplomatic relations had been continuous. Both were free from the stigma of colonial empire building by force. Twice they had been allies in war. Since 1941, they had been dependent each on the other for ultimate victory over the European Axis. Ideologically, however, they were in diametric opposition. Out of this cleavage between the governmental systems of two great powers, there might develop in the world two hostile camps, whose differences would ultimately provoke another Holocaust of war. Should the gulf, however, be bridged practically by effective methods of cooperation, the peace and unity of the world would be assured. No other division among the nations could be considered a menace to world unity and peace, provided mutual confidence and trust could be developed between America and the Soviets. Obstacles, doubts, fears of failure in American-Soviet relations were on every side. But the alternative to success seemed so terrifying to contemplate that all of us sought every possible avenue through which progress might be achieved.
Many Americans feel that our position in post-war Germany would be stronger today if the U.S. Army had been ordered to drive at full speed for Berlin. But the military considerations at the time made such a move unfeasible for the Supreme Commander.
When we stood on the Rhine in the last week of March 1945, we were 300 miles from Berlin, with the obstacle of the Elbe still 200 miles to our front. The Russian forces were firmly established only 30 miles from Berlin. For us to attempt to invest Berlin, I felt to be more than unwise. It was stupid.
As soon as the war in Europe had ended, the relations of the Western powers with the Russians became a matter of prime importance. In early August, General Eisenhower received an invitation from Moscow to visit the head of the Soviet government there. The general accepted promptly. Diplomatically, his visit was valuable as a goodwill gesture toward our Soviet ally. And like many other Americans, the general had a natural curiosity about Russia, its people, and its mode of life.
The Generalissimo suggested that a particular date to be included in my visit was August 12th, a day set aside for a national sports parade in Moscow. Just after we had arrived, the Generalissimo extended to me an invitation to join him on top of Lenin's tomb with two of my associates, provided I should like to do so. I was told the invitation was precedent-making. No other foreigner had ever been invited to set foot on top of Lenin's tomb. Realizing, therefore, that a special courtesy was intended, I quickly said that I would be happy indeed to accept. We stood for 5 hours on the tomb while the show went on. None of us had ever witnessed anything remotely similar. Every kind of folk dance, mass exercise, acrobatic feat, and athletic exhibition was executed with flawless precision, and apparently with the greatest enthusiasm. The sports parade was staged in the Red Square, a paved area of considerable acreage. Estimates as to the number of the performers varied between 20 and 50,000. I calculated that the lower figure was more nearly correct. The Generalissimo showed no sign of fatigue. While we were watching the spectacle, he said, "This develops the war spirit. Your country ought to do more of this." And then he added, "We will never allow Germany to do this." I was pleased at this chance to see a country I had never before visited, but I was even more pleased by the implication that the Soviet government was as interested in developing friendly contacts as we were.
The war had left large sections of Russia in ruins. Soon after VE Day, the inhabitants of the cities and towns which had been demolished in the titanic struggle between the Red Army and the Nazi Wehrmacht began the slow process of rebuilding their communities. In Stalingrad, the people went about the task of building virtually a new city on the ruins of the old.
At that time, soon after VE Day, we saw no reason why the Russian system of government and democracy as practiced by the Western allies could not live side by side in the world, provided each respected the rights, the territory, and the convictions of the other, and avoided overt or covert action against the integrity of the other. Because implicit in Western democracy is respect for the rights of others, it seemed natural to us that this live and let live type of agreement could be achieved and honestly kept. That was probably the most for which we ever really hoped.
But although General Eisenhower found the daily life of the Russian people fairly similar to that of Americans, The reconciliation of the two ideologies was a far different matter, the general was convinced.
Marshal Zhukov seemed to be a firm believer in the communist concept. He said that we Americans induced a man to do things by telling him he might keep what he earned and might say what he pleased. In spite of my complete repudiation of the Marshal's contentions and my condemnation of all systems that involved dictatorship, there was no doubt in my mind that he was sincere.
With the wartime alliance receding into the pages of history, the Russian-American relationship grew steadily more troubled. The strain was most apparent in Germany, where Russian and American decisions on the administration of conquered Germany often clashed directly. Russia's blockade of Berlin, an attempt to cut off supplies for the city's western zones, came perilously close to precipitating a major crisis. This Soviet policy of belligerent bluffing was thwarted by the British and American airlift, which successfully ran the blockade for 11 months and finally forced the Russians to end it.
Several years of growing tension have shattered our dream of rapid progress toward universal peace and the elimination of armaments.
In the organizing conference of the United Nations at San Francisco, people all over the world saw new hope for international accord.
The democracies must learn that the world is now too small for the rigid concepts of national sovereignty that developed in a time when the nations were self-sufficient and self-dependent for their own well-being and safety. None of them today can stand alone. If the men and women of America face this issue as squarely and bravely as their soldiers faced the terrors of battle in World War II, we would have no fear of the outcome.
Between the victory in Europe and the final victory in Japan, in this most destructive of all wars, you have won a victory against war itself. If we had had this charter a few years ago, and above all, the will to use it, millions now dead would be alive. If we should falter in the future in our will to use it, millions now living will surely die.
The reports that reached us after the first one was used against the enemy at Hiroshima on August 6th left no doubt in our minds that a new era of warfare had begun. In an instant, many of the old concepts of war were swept away. Henceforth, it would seem, the purpose of an aggressor nation would be to stock atom bombs in quantity and to employ them by surprise against the industrial fabric and population centers of its intended victims. Even the bombed ruins of Germany suddenly seemed to provide but faint warning of what future war could mean to the people of the earth. But on all sides, there was evidence of the destruction that Hitler's ruthless ambition had brought about. Germany's bridges were down, her cities in ruins, and her great industrial capacity practically paralyzed. Between September 1939 and May 1945, millions of Europeans had been killed and many millions more left homeless. In Germany itself, after years of seeming invincibility, a carpet of destruction and desolation had spread over the land. Of all the distressing memories that will forever live with American veterans of the war in Europe, none will be sharper or more enduring than those of the DPs, the truly unfortunate, who, for one reason or another, no longer had homes or were persecutees who dare not return home for fear of further persecution. Volumes have been, and more volumes will be written, on the collapse of world cooperation and the true significance of the events that accompanied the tragedy. I felt and hoped that the lessons which 6 years of unremitting war had brought to the world would convince everyone everywhere that the employment of force in the international field should of necessity be abjured. With the evidence of the most destructive war yet waged by the people of the earth about me, I gained increased hope that this development of what appeared to be the ultimate in destruction would drive men in self-preservation to find a way of eliminating war. Maybe it is only wishful thinking to believe that fear, universal fear, might possibly succeed where statesmanship and religion had not yet won success.
The first major post-war problem for the Allies in Europe was the administration of conquered Germany, a task which demanded ready cooperation and mutual confidence among the victors.
From the record of Russian contacts with the Western Allies during the war, we believed in the early summer of 1945 that success in joint government of Germany would be measured almost exclusively by the degree to which the Western Allies, both generally and locally, overcame Russian suspicion and distrust. There was a vast gulf to be bridged between governmental systems.
For all the peoples of the world, 1945 was a most critical year. A month before the end of the war in Europe, free people in all parts of the globe were stunned by a tragic loss.
The day of April 12th ended on a note of dramatic climax when we heard the news of President Roosevelt's death. We pondered over the effect the president's death might have upon the future peace.